Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
So we have a bit of drizzle here today, so I've got an umbrella with me.
Perfect. That sounds good. Looks a little gray there.
Yeah, it's not what I expected. Just with you recording it. You're muted.
Great. I just put it back on, Danny. Thanks so much.
Okay. So it is drizzling here today, so you can see I have the umbrella. I'm trying to keep the rain off the camera and my glasses so that I can perform, but I'll be using one hand for that and using my neck to hold the umbrella as well. But nonetheless, I just wanted to switch my video around and show you so this is the Walla Walla Valley. What has taken off in the last 30 years are the wine grapes and producing premium quality wines down here in the valley. But a lot of the orchards have given way to the grapes, as you can see. But one of my passions is obviously cherries, and sweet cherries in particular. So this particular block is a Rainier block, and the grower is Jimmy Reese. He is 88 years old, and he is probably one of the finest cherry producers I've worked with anywhere in the world. He is he's a great collaborator. He's very innovative, which you don't always find amongst a lot of cherry farmers. So not that that's meant to be. The fact that you have people online today means that you have innovators there. So it's good to work with those people who are the innovators and leaders in bringing about change in their blocks. But a lot of this work was inspired by working with Lin Long in the Dells. And when I first joined Oregon State University 15 years ago, Lin was instrumental in introducing me to the training systems, the pruning and training systems that were geared towards pedestrian orchards. And the one in particular that I really like is the Spanish bush, because it's a lot easier to work with. It doesn't need a lot of training, and the UFO is another good one, but it does need the trellising systems, and it's very finicky. It is easier to harvest, which is the major advantage of that system. But the Spanish bush, which became the modified KGB, the Kim Green bush system, is one that I particularly like. And in the Milton Freewater area, I'm not sure if you can see the orchard in the distance, but typically the trees are older trees, as you can see from the diameter of these trees. Some of these trees are 50 years old. They got replaced in, not this block, but in the valley. They got replaced in the 1956 freeze, which cracked all the trees down the middle, and the valley turned into a tomato producing area, and the cherry trees all got replanted. So a lot of the old blocks in this Walla Walla Valley are from the 57 replant. And as a result, they just grew. And the growers typically ended up with open vase type systems. And you'll see a lot of those old open vase type systems all over the valley. And what ends up happening is you have an inverted pyramid, and all the fruit ends up at the top of the tree. And the growers then run a pruning, a hedging tool over the top of the orchard at about 15 feet. And what that does is it stimulates all the vigor at the top of the trees. And having visited Lin in the Dells, looking at those pedestrian orchards that he was encouraging and promoting down in the Dells in Wasco County, I started to think about the rejuvenation opportunities for older trees. We also had, after I'd formulated some ideas, I went back to Lin in the Dells and we took a look at Mike Omig's blocks, and his manager at the time showed us some of the work, which was contrary to what I expected. And it got me thinking again about how we manage these blocks and bring them back into production. So this particular block, I started doing some work with the Stadelman's group in 2015. And I sent some pictures through in a Dropbox folder, which you probably shared, have you, Molly?
I didn't share the Dropbox folder yet, Clive, but we've got them loaded so that if you want to show any of them, and we can share it after, if that's all right.
Okay. So basically what happened was the farm manager at Saddleman's at the time, he subsequently left, but he approached me and said, you know, he really wants to do something about his block. He has one of those 50 or 60-year-old blocks, which was low yielding, small fruit, soft fruit, and he needed to do something about it because his yields were down at about 2.5 to 3 tons per acre. So I said to him, well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start seeing if we can start rejuvenating the trees. And my some of the background to what the work that I've done, and perhaps I should just swing my camera back since you probably want to see me rather than the trees at this point. Some of the work that I did on pruning stemmed back from the postdoc that I did in Australia with the Queensland government on avocados. And there we actually did rejuvenation of large avocado trees that were probably 40 meters in height. Since I know you guys work in meters, I'll use the old terminology I'm used to. So those trees were 40 meters in height, and all the farmers in Australia were concerned about the fact that their trees were getting bigger and bigger and higher. They couldn't spray them. They couldn't get the chemicals to the tops of the trees where the diseases and insects were hanging out. And the final straw for one of the farmers in Australia was when a large Anaheim avocado fell from about 30 meters and hit her smack in the middle of the face and broke her nose, and she had to have plastic surgery to put her face back together. So that was the final straw. And she said, we're going to cut down this block because we can't carry on like this. And they asked me if I'd work with them. So I said to them, well, why don't we try alternate rows, 2 alternate rows, because my logic was that the light interception in between them would continue to give fruit production on the interrows that hadn't been rejuvenated. So what we did was we went in and we did alternate rows. And the principle that I was working on, avocados are different than deciduous trees because they are terminal bearers, and the more terminals you have, the more fruiting surfaces you have. It's the same as citrus. Most of the tropicals, mangoes, citrus, avocados, lychees, all those different crops are terminal bearers. So the concept there was that increasing the complexity, as many terminals as possible, was what I was trying to get to. So I topped the trees at the center of the tree, and I tipped the sides of them constantly to increase complexity, because every time you take away apical dominance, you break that apical dominance if you've taken away more than 1/3 of the growth, and that causes branching. So that was one of the principles that I was looking at with this rejuvenation of the cherry trees, was utilizing the complexity issue, and it started to weld nicely with the Spanish bush and the KGB type systems. So I convinced Austin, the farm manager of Stadelman's, to let us prune trees. And he went back to head office, asked them for permission, and his manager said, you can do 3 trees of each. We're not giving you more than 3 trees because this isn't proven. So we did 3 trees of each. And if you send out the picture, you can see the 3 different trees. I wanted to do it as I'd done the avocado trees in Australia, which I did them at pocket height. And basically that's at the bottom of your pocket where your hand comes to. That was where I wanted to prune the trees off to. Austin allowed me to do that with the first 3 trees, but he wasn't comfortable with that. So he went with 6 feet and 9 feet and 12 feet. So we had 3 trees of each, 3, 6, 9, and 12 feet. I guess you can work out what feet are in Canada, because we're all about, well, I'm 6 foot, so it's basically the head of my height and halfway down my body is basically 1 meter, 2 meter, 1.5 meters, sorry, 0.5 meter, 1 meter, 1.5 and 2 meters would be the equivalent in Canadian metric system. So one of the key things that happened was, while I was doing that work, we didn't say anything. We were just doing it in the block. And Jimmy, being the innovator that he is, approached me and said, look, I need to do something about my trees, because this block was also about probably 6 meters tall when I first came here. And Jimmy asked me if we could do something about the block. And I said, well, Jimmy, you're in full production. The trees had formed a cathedral where the branches had grown together in interrows, and I'll show you. It's getting back to that. When you look down here, you can start to see the cathedral forming again, where you've got this nice avenue that you can walk down, and you're starting to see, if you look down there, just at the general shape of the block, you can start to see the inverted pyramid coming back again. And I'll get into the reasons for why this is starting to happen. But basically, when Jimmy first started this, he came and looked at the trees that we've been pruning at Stadelman's, and he said, "Well, I think I'm gonna do the same thing." And what precipitated it was we had a freeze in 2017 that took out every single fruiting spur on these trees. So it was the perfect time to do the rejuvenation of these blocks. So Jimmy started on this end of the block, and he started pruning at about 8 feet. And you can see I can take you in here and show you some of the branches. There's one of the pruning cuts. And these trees, he did them at basically he staghorned them. Staghorning is when you go through and you top the trees to the major limbs, but he didn't take them back to the bottom. So he staghorned these trees at around, in fact, he started at 10 feet. And then he came back and he looked at what we were doing, and he got more brave, and he got more brave as he went through the block. So he started coming lower and lower across the block until eventually, by the time he got to the end of the block, we started to see he was doing it at about 4 feet, which is where I wanted to do it in the first place. And that is one of the key things that a take-home message for me when you're rejuvenating trees, and old trees in particular, is that where you prune those trees to is where you get the branching. You can see it every time. So if I take you inside here, and you can see the large trees. Now, these ones, he was starting to do actual stumping rather than staghorning. And you can see where these trees are stumped. We painted them with copper and white latex water-based paint. And so all the pruning cuts were painted, as you can see. There. So we painted all those wound sites so we wouldn't get infection into the trees. And so so effectively we started stumping. And then what happens is with Austin, we started to see the results in terms of stumping. Now, we stumped the trees when they were dormant in the first instance. So we cut those trees back to dormant trees. We cut them back to stumps by the middle of February. We had finished pruning those trees, or stumping them back. And you can see this section here, where, as I say, Jimmy got braver as he progressed, and he became more confident and more comfortable with what we were doing. He started to get down to where I was hoping we would go in the first place. So you can see these were stumped, and this is basically pocket height. So let me show you the camera. So I hope you can see that, but there's my pocket height, and these trees were stumped back. So this now has resulted in effectively what is a pedestrian tree, because, as I said, the lower you go, where you prune the tree to is where you get branching. You break apical dominance. So if you break it back down that end of the block at 8 to 10 feet, that's where you're going to get your branching. So you've defeated some of the object of getting the fruit where you want it by allowing it to branch at 8 feet, because the branches go from 8 feet upwards. Whereas when you bring it down to 4 feet, the branches start at 4 feet, and you can pick those fruit standing on the ground. Jimmy has as I mentioned, he's very innovative, and he has some contraptions that he's built over the years, one of them being a flatbed. He was one of the first people to introduce flatbeds for picking and pruning, which he pulls behind a tractor. So he does a lot of the picking and harvesting at that end of the block. He still uses his platform that he picks off. But down this end of the block, he's able to pick these fruit with ladders. So these trees, as I mentioned, were stumped at 4 feet tall, and the regrowth on the trees. Now, what happened is I got a bit sidetracked. I was talking about the timing was February. So this block was all done in February as well. So when the trees were dormant. But what we started to see was that those trees didn't start pushing buds for about 3 to 4 weeks after the trees that hadn't been pruned in the Saddleman's block. So what you have is you have a delay in the buds pushing. Now, part of the reason for that is that when you stump the tree, you have to go through totipotency. And totipotency is the term given to cells that revert back from being normal living cells. They revert back to meristematic cells, and they produce, they go through mitotic divisions, and they produce buds again. So they can turn an ordinary cell back into a vegetative bud. So totipotency took time to kick in. Now, part of the reason for that was that by stumping the trees in February when they're dormant, you don't have any, you don't have anything to encourage water movement when the soil starts to warm up, and you normally would have buds pushing, opening, transpiration taking place, pulling water through the tree. And part of the key, I believe, in understanding pruning effects is understanding the differences between the auxins and the cytokinins. So just a bit of quick physiology, the auxin production is what takes place in the apical meristems of all plants. So as the cells are dividing in the meristem, at the top of the plant, the shoot meristems, they're producing auxin, which moves by gravity down through the tree, and it's multifunctional. The first thing it does is it inhibits shoot growth, but then it also encourages root growth. So as the auxin concentrations are high at the top of the tree, where all the buds are, you get inhibition of growth up there, but as it gets dilute, as it falls by gravity and it gets dilute, you get branching at the bottom of the tree, which explains the growth of trees in terms of how they're inhibited. But then at the same time, you have cytokinins being produced by the roots and coming up into the tree, and they are their name cytokinin comes from cytokinesis, which is cell division from Greek. So they're encouraging cell division. So those are that's the plant growth hormone that you need to encourage the growth. Now, as you can imagine, on a stump tree, you don't have any buds, so you don't have any growth, and you have poor water movement through the tree. So one thing that we found when we did another tree later on was that we left a nurse branch if there was one available, and that nurse branch actually encourages growth quicker. So you do get the growth on that nurse branch sooner, and the whole tree rejuvenates. But the problem with having a nurse branch is as soon as that branch starts pushing cytokinins, it's time to get it off. So, yep, that's exactly it. So you can see the trees in the background that were the 15 feet. This is the stump tree in the foreground. And so what happens is if you leave that nurse branch, you will encourage growth sooner. So then during the second year of our trials, while we were doing the tree that you see in front of you, the second year, Austin decided to see how far into the season we could prune or stump the trees or cut them back and still get growth in that season. And what we found is that around the 22nd of June, the trees remained dormant after that. So if we pruned them back, we didn't get a major flush after June. But anything up to June 22nd, we got a flush on those trees if we stumped them and brought them back. So that is one thing that you can do if you have an old block that isn't healthy, and that's another thing that I wouldn't encourage, is trying to rejuvenate old trees that aren't healthy, because what we saw in some instances is trees that weren't healthy, they did not come back well, and some of them died. And it's simply because you don't have that cytokinin movement through the actual tree to stimulate the bud growth. But as you can see, this entire block, Jimmy's block was a very healthy block. We didn't have a single tree go down on us in this particular block. And the stumping of the trees, what you do get is you get a proliferation of shoots. And those shoots they come out of the stumped branches, and when you do this, you get a massive proliferation of shoots. Now, the problem is if you just leave all those shoots, you end up with too much complexity, and you end up with no light interception, you end up with no airflow, and that means you end up with a lot of diseases. So what we did in the settlements block, and subsequently I worked with Jimmy and he did the same thing, was we went through, and it's a rule of thumb, it's actually a rule of middle finger and thumb, is that what I do is I take my hand, I don't know if you want to show it, Molly.
You might just have to bear with us while we find it, Clive.
I'm not used to doing monologues like this, so please, anytime, I don't mind people interrupting me if they want to. So, and if you see chat messages that are coming through, please just interrupt me and ask them if it's something that they want more clarity or anything. I think you have to stop sharing your screen. There we go. So we're back. So what I do is it's the rule of thumb is index finger to thumb. When I spread them out, and that's the distance between shoots that I want to keep on the actual stumps. And you can see that when we go through here, all these shoots, we use that rule of thumb. So we don't have shoots that are crossing over. That's another thing we don't want, is crossing over. But so what we did was we encouraged these shoots at roughly, I would say 15 centimeters apart on the stems of these trees. Now, the regrowth that you get, having looked at the KGB system, I was very interested in trying to simulate that. And what you're seeing now is Jimmy's, I haven't been here for the last 8 months, and Jimmy, being 88, is starting to forget things, so he doesn't always follow through on a lot of the instructions that I do give him anymore. So, but it does create an example here where I can start to show you some of the things that go wrong when you don't fully implement and commit to the KGB system. So what happens is I was trying to achieve 28 shoots on each of these stumps. Now with the KGB system, you end up with rejuvenating a third of the tree every year. So that means that your whole tree becomes rejuvenated after 4 years. When Jimmy did this in the first year, he got all these shoots going up, and the fruit size was phenomenal. The fruit was large and it was firm, and it had a lot of flavor, and the sugars were high as well. They were about 25 degrees Brix. So the first year that when they came back into production, and sorry, when I say the first year, it wasn't year one after the pruning, because the first year that you do the pruning, you get the shoots, and those shoots obviously don't have any fruiting spurs on them. The fruiting spurs are 2-year-old wood. So part of what I learned with Lynn when we looked at Mike Omeg's orchards is that if you rejuvenate an old tree and you have shoot growth, the worst thing you can do to that shoot growth is prune it at the end of the first year. So that's one of the key lessons in this, is that do not touch those upright shoots that you get on the tree. Because if you prune them, you'll stimulate a vegetative growth flush at the top of the tree, and you'll end up with 4 shoots that just take off and become apically dominant. And then your tree is back up to 7 meters before you know it. So that's the first key thing here when you're doing this kind of rejuvenation, is leave those shoots alone. And the following year, you'll get apical dominance being broken. So you get intercalation, and intercalation is what takes place. And there's a good example of it. Let me switch my camera around. So intercalation is what takes place in the dormant shoots. And so what happens at the end of fall is growth slows down and your buds start to get closer together. Those buds clump together as effectively what becomes known as the intercalation. And then in spring, the apical bud starts growing again. So when you look at the stem, you have, or a branch of stem, you start to see the leaves getting further and further apart as you go into summer. But then as you go into fall, the leaves get closer and closer together. So it's the whole growth of the leaves. And what that does is it creates the intercalation, which is the following year's clump bud. And those clump buds end up producing shoots. If you leave it alone and you allow the apical bud to go up, they will produce shoots. And then you end up with these side shoots where you have, and another good one to show you would be this one here, where you've ended up with these side shoots. And as you can see, the weight of that is too heavy and it's starting to fall over. So you start to see bending when you have excess of growth at the tops of the trees. So that was another good lesson to realize, is that your trees need to be rejuvenated. Another reason you want to rejuvenate them is you start to lose productivity. In the first year, all these fruiting spurs, and you can see the remnants of the fruiting spurs here, all these fruiting spurs are covered in fruit. These trees, and you can see on that branch there again, these shoots, and this is the second year after pruning that they flowered, so they're spurred up. So the third year, they came back into production. And the branches were literally covered in fruit. And here's a little bit of an example of, although it's leaning down, it's leaned down because of the weight. But that was the kind of fruiting that you were getting on those 2-year-old shoots that were upright and producing large, firm fruit that had great flavor. So that is one of the lessons as well, is that if you rejuvenate an old block and you just let it go, which is effectively what Jimmy's ended up doing here, because he's lost confidence in the KGB system, and he's also forgetting, but he's ended up letting these trees go, and he's not doing A, the rejuvenation, and he's not doing B, the pruning that he needs to do at the top of the tree to get rid of a lot of that complexity. So a lot of those shoots, the intercalation shoots, the side shoots, not a lot of them, all of them should have been stubbed back. Another thing that we're starting to see is that after, this is now the 5th year, so these would have been, so in fact, I think the first pruning we did on this block was been 15, because these are now 5 years back into rejuvenation. But basically by not rejuvenating the uprights, okay, you start to lose the productivity along them. These were all fruiting spurs last year. They've been lost. What's ended up happening is you're not getting light interception down here any longer. Here's one that grew back, and you can see some of the upright shoots with the fruiting spurs. But the problem is you're not getting light interception any longer because the tops of the trees have been allowed to start shading out the bottom of the trees. So it's absolutely critical to rejuvenate the trees. And I know it's hard to take out a third of the tree because you're looking at the production you've got on those branches. But if you don't, you end up in this situation where all your fruiting surfaces are now moving back up to 15 feet in the tree. So the key thing here, and you can see that's where all the productivity is, way up there at the top of the tree, and you want that all down here. So it's absolutely key. And then another thing to realize, and again, it's hard because when you do this rejuvenation, you've changed the root to shoot ratio in favor of the roots. So you've removed, and when you stump these trees back down to pocket height, you've removed probably 80% of the oxen by taking away the top of the tree, but you still got that equivalent in cytokinins at the base of the tree. So you get the benefit in that you rejuvenate the trees quickly. You get a lot of shoot growth, but then also in that large rooting mass that you've got when you disturb the root to shoot ratio, you've also got a massive reserve of carbohydrates, so stored starch down there in the roots, which is plowed back into fruit when they start to fruit the following year. So you end up with much larger fruit than you normally would have, because you've got this excess carbohydrate store that's now being channeled into fruit. So you end up with very large fruit, and eventually, if you do nothing to the trees, you end up reestablishing the root to shoot ratio. And that's what's ended up happening here, is you've ended up balancing the 1-to-1 root to shoot ratio. And the net result is this year, the fruit are all smaller on these trees. So it's really key to managing the auxin cytokinins, the carbohydrate balance, and light is what it all boils down to. So it's really critical to go through and rejuvenate these trees. So another good reason why every 3 years is that this is year 5, and you can see that because these trees have not been rejuvenated in year 4, you're ending up with small fruit. Another thing to notice is that you haven't had much regrowth on these trees. Now, part of the reason for that is that Jimmy hasn't fertilized these trees. He hasn't been out here quite managing the trees like he used to. These trees used to be really, really vigorous. But another thing to realize is that by not doing any pruning of these shoots, is that you end up with insufficient leaf numbers and surface area to support the fruit on the actual stems. So by not topping the tops of these trees in year 3 after rejuvenation, you start to end up with this situation where you don't have sufficient carbohydrates, and also you end up with these small fruit. So the roots have expended their carbohydrate bonus that they put back into fruiting, but you need to have sufficient leaf area, surface area, to support them after year 3 when you're back into a balanced situation. By rejuvenating the trees, you're always going to be encouraging the carbohydrate balance in favor of the roots, which then obviously will give you a benefit in terms of fruit size. So it's really critical after the 3rd year to go through and remove a third of the upright branches. Now, when you remove them, you're going to stump them. You're not going to completely cut them back, because you want shoots to come off those. So you've got the complexity of the shoots. You're going to go through and you're going to stump them to 6 inches or 15 centimeters. So that's the critical thing here, is taking out a third of the tree. And strategically, what we also found, and perhaps you should back up one step, when you do the stumping, you are going to see tons of branches forming, shoots coming off those stumps. But invariably what happens is you end up with 3 that become apically dominant and really dominant branches. And that was one thing that I did manage to persuade Jimmy to do, was to go through and remove those 3 dominant shoots. And you can see one over here. That one was a shoot that was removed. It was a regrowth shoot and it was removed. So we typically, otherwise you end up with this situation where you have this really thick, and to give you some perspective, I'll just drop the umbrella. This is my hand, and it doesn't go all the way around the shoot. So this is a regrowth shoot, and it was a dominant one. And you'll see that on these trees. Here's another one. Right. These dominant shoots, those 3 dominant shoots in the 1st year, my advice is to take them out, because they start to inhibit all the others. And you end up with shorter shoots, because when you think of the cherry tree, it's a timber tree. Cherry wood is famed. It was grown as timber, in the steppes of Russia, which is where it comes from, the epicenter. So the natural habit of the tree is to want to go back and establish itself as a dominant tree in the forest. So you're going to get that regrowth. By stumping it, you got 3, but those 3 will become dominant and power through. So we went through, and for the most part, Jimmy removed those 3 dominant shoots. And what that does is it spreads out the remaining carbohydrates to the rest of the branches, and you don't get a dominant branch when you do that. So you end up with thinner branches, and you end up with more of those branches because they're not inhibited by the tops of the trees. So again, it comes back to apical dominance. So the other thing is, at the tops of these trees, they should have been, because the regrowth in these was sometimes 2 meters. And as I say, just leave them alone. Don't touch them. Let them spur up in year 2, and then you'll have fruit in year 3, back into full production, and you'll get the largest fruit you've seen in the process. But as I said, keeping those trees rejuvenated, preventing the intercalation from forming lots of shoots, because the other thing you can see when you start to get these intercalation shoots is you start to see shading effects, and you can't see light through the tree. And that's the worst case scenario, because as soon as you don't have light, you don't get flower induction and you don't get fruit. So that leads to top heavy trees with lots of branches at the top. And yes, they produce fruit, but they're out of reach. And then the bottom of the tree loses all its production. So you end up with this situation where you have this light benefit at the top of the tree, and you end up effectively, you're starting to get an inverted pyramid. So if I take a step back without falling on the rocks here, you start to see your inverted pyramid coming back again. And that's the worst case scenario that you want to see in a cherry block, because you're basically getting back to the orchard the way it was when you first started rejuvenating it. So it's key to keep stumping a third of those branches. And again, after year 4, you can start to see even more reason why you need to do it, because you've got small fruit. You've run out of the carbohydrate surge that you need, and you get that, as I mentioned, from the roots. And by rejuvenating the tree, you're always throwing the carbohydrate balance back in favor of the roots. So you're always going to see larger fruit when you do that rejuvenation. There's a slight yield loss, but at the same time, you'd rather have large fruit. Fewer large fruit run over the packing line produces more money than lots of small fruit. So at this point in time, I was wondering if there were any questions.
Yeah, we did have a question, Clive, about what rootstock these trees are on.
These trees are on these are on Mazid. Okay, so it's an old block on Mazid, and in fact, Mazid actually being less inhibitory than the geezers and the newer varieties. This that's actually a benefit when you're doing rejuvenation, because you want the regrowth. You actually want to stimulate that regrowth. So I actually prefer working with an old block, an old orchard on Mazid rootstocks, because the vigor is what what you benefit from. The downside of it is the vigor can get away from you, like it has here, where you're ending up with 15 feet trees again, instead of having them down here where you want them, which is picking height to 6 to 8 feet, and all the fruit down at pocket height.
Clive, I have a question here. I just unmuted myself. And sometimes when we've pruned large limbs out of older cherry trees, we've run into some wood rotting fungi, maybe Cytospora or Polyporus, and we've incorporated broad spectrum fungicide with the paint. And that's a practice that we've sometimes followed. I wonder if you've had to do that.
We didn't. It's not, the US is very strict about on-label use of the pesticides, and I'm not sure that would be, I haven't seen it registered on a label here in the States, but the copper gave us the protection that we needed. Jimmy went through and mixed the copper with the latex paint, and all the pruning cuts we painted with that, and we didn't see a single tree go down on us. You can see, let me turn my camera around. We didn't see a single tree go down on us when we did that.
So I have a question about, I have a KGB block that's in the 4th year. So it's not yet in full production. It probably should be close by next year. I did go in and take out the strongest uprights this year out of probably one out of each tree, but I'm only going for about 14 or 15 uprights. So by next year, I should be going in and taking out a third of those, or
a third of the remaining branches. The next, if you're doing 15, that means you got to do a rejuvenation of 5. So you're going to go through and take out the next 5, but you're going to stub them back to 6 inches. You're going to take them back to 6 inches, and I would take the most vigorous ones, because again, the balance gets put back in favor of the roots, the carbohydrate balance in the roots. So always select your most vigorous 5 shoots to take out of the tree. If you're going with 15 as your...
That is hard to do, because you're just getting ready to fruit them, right?
I know. You look at it and you think, well, gee, I've got so much fruit here, and you think next year it's going to be the same, but it never is, because of the increased height and the increased shading. You lose the spurs and you lose the fruiting production. So it's always hard to do, but you've got to be cruel to be kind when it comes to running the KGB system.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Don. We have another question here about what was the tons per acre difference now as compared to 3 tons per acre that you started with?
So that was in the Stadelman block. Jimmy's block here, he's probably getting around 30% more yield from these trees than what he was getting before. But the other added advantage is that for the last 4 years, or last 3 years, all those fruit have been picked from the ground. This is the first year where the fruit have got out of control, and he's going to have to go to ladders and run his platform through again. But for those first 3 years, when he was following the model well, the fruit was all accessible from the ground, and your picking costs double when you go to ladders. So that in itself is a huge saving, not having to use step ladders. So, but certainly the yield increase, there was at least a 30% bump in yield on these trees. And the other point is that it's consistent. So what Jimmy was seeing with his older trees was he was starting to see alternate bearing. Whereas with this, there's been 0 alternate bearing. Every year we've had a massive crop set on these trees. And I would estimate at the moment he's probably harvesting about 12 tons to the acre off this block.
Clive, the initial dehorning that was done, how late into the season could you go with that?
So the Stadelman's block, we did it all in dormant, and that was all done by the 15th. But with the subsequent trees that Austin was heading back, we were able to head back right through to June 22 and still get regrowth that year. So it's pushing it now, because what are we on, the 8th or 9th maybe of June? But you still, if somebody were interested in doing some experimental heading back, you could still do some for the next week. So the fact that you asked me to give this talk now is pretty good timing. But again, what I would recommend is that if you do, because remember that each situation is different in terms of climate and the prevailing conditions, rootstock signs, etc. So if you're going to do it, do some after the 15th of June, after the 22nd of June as well, just to confirm that for the Canadian situation, that is when you want to do the cutoff in terms of any redress of the branching. I think I saw another question.
Yeah, we have another question. I think you may have answered. I believe Grant's question was referring to sort of the maximum temperature degree days that this could be done until. And the next question was from Danny. I have a 25-year-old Rainier block that's locked into alternate bearing. Would you recommend this as a best way to correct the issue? Just a moment. I think we lost your sound, Clive. Hold on here.
Yeah,
okay,
I had myself
try
muted
that
for some
again.
reason.
Perfect.
So yeah, I would absolutely consider it. the alternate year when the yields are low would be a great time to do it. You know, I don't advise doing it at, 10 feet, 8 feet, 6 feet. I would rather go back down and rejuvenate those trees, because that's where you want the fruit. You want it at picking height, down from pocket height at the bottom of your pockets upwards is where you want your fruit, because that's the ideal picking place for fruit. So I would go through in that alternate year. And the other thing, Jimmy went through and did the whole block, and it's kind of depressing when you see the whole block gone in the first instance, but when you see the regrowth and the yields start coming back in year 2, well, at the end of year 2, you spur up to year 2, and at the beginning of year 3, you're back into full production. So effectively, by doing that, you'll lose 1 year of production. So, maybe do half the block if you're obviously dependent on the yield. Maybe do half the block and then rejuvenate the other half once that's back in production, because you do wait 3 years to come back into production. We were in some ways fortunate that we had that freeze, and I think it was 15 we had the freeze. Now the time runs away so quickly, but yeah, I think it was 15, because these are 5 years back into production, and I mean this is year 5 since it was done, and the fact that we had every single fruiting spur froze out, the trees were in the perfect situation. It was the perfect timing with that deep freeze we had, taking out all the fruiting spurs. So that we didn't lose anything by doing it with that freeze, because they would have taken that long to come back anyway. There was, Dwayne, you mentioned that some areas in Canada have had a freeze that was markedly affecting the fruiting spurs.
Yes, this year, some portions of the Okanagan Valley particularly are really light. They've got, maybe 30% of a crop or even less. So it may be an opportunity for some of those blocks. In the Creston area where I am and many of our participants this morning are, we've got a slightly better crop, I think, than those areas in the Okanagan. But
Right.
There could be an opportunity this year.
Right. Yeah, and as I say, as soon as you get too much weight on the trees, you can see what happens. This. Spin my camera around again. You can start to see these branches just get top heavy, and then they start flattening out and becoming horizontal. And then as soon as you end up with this pendant wood, you don't have growth, so your shoots are inhibited. And then as a result, you can see the shoot growth, extension growth on the end of this branch is only 5 centimeters. And there's nowhere near enough leaves, because you need roughly 35 leaves to support that, the fruiting at the back there, the fruit on that branch. So you end up with insufficient carbohydrates being produced, and then you end up with a soft, small fruit. So as soon as you end up with this pendant growth, you end up with no shoot growth to speak of, which means that your fruit suffers. When you have upright growth, you can see the kind of shooting you do get. But again, allowing that intercalation to produce fruit not only weights it down, but it also doesn't increase the amount of leaf surface area sufficiently. So what should have happened is all those intercalary shoots should have been stubbed, and you should have topped the top of the regrowth. And by doing that, you break the apical dominance, you get 3 shoots coming away, and then you end up with sufficient carbohydrates to support all the fruit all the way down the stem. So then you won't end up with the dead wood where you end up with the spurs all dying out.
So those interlocutory shoots, what length do you stub them back to?
I stubbed them back to 2.5 centimeters, 1 inch.
Okay.
Clive, I was wondering if apogee is used or required anymore in the year following those heavy cuts?
No, we didn't use any plant growth regulators to control growth. We simply wanted to encourage as much upright growth as we could in these trees. So and the first year afterwards, as you can see, when you look at these branches, they produced shoots with leaves, and then all those auxiliary buds turned into fruiting spurs the second year. But those fruiting spurs, and here's another good example of that, those fruiting spurs start to die out if you leave them. So you end up with deadwood with no shooting spurs. So the first year this was done, this was literally covered. So there's an example. I don't know why you can see that, and I can't zoom in because it's an iPhone. But basically you can see the kind of spurs that you would get in the second year on that branch. You can see that you've got the subsequent branching up above that with the intercalation that has been left. But this is the worst case scenario. I don't know if you can see how small these fruit are. Maybe I should put my thumb next to it. There's my thumbnail. And because this is pendant wood, you've ended up with small, and when you press them, they just give. They're soft as well. Whereas when you start to get them on the uprights, you can see the same comparison. The fruit is bigger than my thumbnail. So that's just the stark contrast between upright shoots and horizontal shoots in terms of fruit size.
How close is that fruit to picking?
He's going to start doing some selective picking this week. So he'll probably be harvesting by the end of next week. He'll be in full swing with harvest.
Clive, I've got another question. It's not related as much to rejuvenation, but to the KGB system and looking at some of these new Gisela rootstocks versus using Mazard rootstock to establish a KGB system. Mm-hmm. Any suggestions as to what rootstocks are favorable, what you've seen that's worked quite well?
Yeah, so Lynn and I published several articles on the choice of rootstock for the different systems. And in the Dells, Oregon, the KGB with Mazard compared to, I believe it was both Gisela and, what's the Russian one? Krimsk. So I think we had 5 and 6 of both Krimsk and G6 and G5. We didn't do G12, and G12 is slightly less dwarfing. So, you know, my personal choice, if I was going to do a KGB now, I would use a Mazard as the rootstock. And Lynn's work in the Dells, that ended up showing that KGB on Mazard rootstocks actually produced the best yields over time.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to pause are there any other questions if people would like to put into the chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask Clive any other questions? Thanks for braving the rain out there, Clive. I hope you didn't get soaked as you walked us around.
Nah,
the orchard.
It's just a miserable drivel. So it would have messed my glasses up and covered the screen of the camera. So just nuisance drops. It's a green drop, really.
All right. Well, that worked really well. I do think that we were a little bit concerned about having good Wi-Fi connection in the orchard, but I think that went quite well, and we were able to really see what you were looking at, and it really illustrates the point of what was happening with your rejuvenation. So if there aren't any other questions, let me just see here. I think we're good in the chat. All right. Okay. Well, then I think we will let you go and dry off and hopefully get a warm cup of coffee. So
Great.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate you joining us. That was some great information and a really interesting example of how a block can be rejuvenated. And I had forgotten to mention at the beginning of the call, but we did have a number of members of the BC Cherry Association Research Committee join us, and many of them are in the Okanagan that have suffered from a fairly significant loss this year due to winter, so damage and frost. So it's interesting to have this information. One more thing, if there is any background literature, Clive, that you would suggest, perhaps you and I or Dwayne can touch base about
Sure.
perhaps
Well,
accessing some papers as well.
I guess I can do a shameless plug.
Of course.
Lynn Long, Greg Lang, and I have just written a book for growers, and it's going to be CAB International, the British Cambridge International. It's a handbook for growers, and we do cover. Lynn does a great job of the pruning systems on the dwarfing rootstocks in terms of young blocks, and I've also done some work there and shown some pictures of the rejuvenation of the old blocks. So that book will be coming out, we hope, by the end of August, and it will, in fact, we just got a visitor here who I can spin around and introduce you to. Well, hardly a visitor, he's actually the owner. So,
most of them are good rows.
Morning, Jimmy.
What I'll show you to do. All of these need to be done, but
Jimmy, I've got Canada online.
good.
They're live with him.
Good morning.
Yeah. Are we near Timbuktu?
Canada? No, that's Africa. There's Molly, and there's about 25 Canadian cherry farmers online. So
Good morning,
Well-
Jimmy. Thanks for having us on an orchard tour this morning.
Tell them it is raining here, and I will send you some cracked cherries.
We've had enough of our own rain, thanks. Thanks for having us in your block
Well,
today.
Before you let Jimmy go, just maybe, Jimmy, can you give them an idea of how difficult it was to do this rejuvenation pruning?
Do what now?
The rejuvenation, so pruning your blocks back. How did you
when
find
they
it?
got froze?
Yes.
Yeah. We were told to cut those things off so far from the ground and using our belly buttons as the measuring point.
Pocket out.
I would put you to work in a bikini, and if I could see your belly button, I know you were cutting them
I'm
off.
not sure any of you want to see that.
Yeah.
We got new sprouts.
Right.
We got a new orchard out of one that was damaged.
And you
A
were happy.
lot of guys gave up, but we cut them and we got new growth.
And you're happy with the results.
Yeah,
And the yields, you found were acceptable, as good as what you saw before, if not better.
well, because it's new growth. And a Renewal cherry, the only way you can get big ones is on new growth. Yeah, got a lot of little ones out here now, but I missed a day, a year with some hospital problems. And we got new growth, but we got a lot of little cherries. We're still kind of pruning at picking time, thinning. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you very
Appreciate it.
much. We
Thanks
appreciate
for-
the tour.
Whoops. Yeah, thanks for letting us dissect your orchard this morning. So, yeah, my apologies for the inappropriate comments, but that's part of the course when you get old, I guess.
Well, thank you again, Clive. We really appreciate you taking the time this morning to go out to the field and show us around, and certainly look forward to following up with you again. Hopefully we can host you up this way when things open up again.
Yeah, that would be nice, because I've really not seen any of the Canadian cherry orchards. It's, driven up to Peachland once, but never actually stopped in at any commercial blocks. So it'd be nice to do a tour up there one of these days.
Well, excellent. I would think I can speak for many of the growers online today that we'd be very happy to have you and show you around. So best wishes to you for the rest of the season. It looks like harvest is pretty close to starting, and I think we will conclude there for the call today.
Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate
All right.
it.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Take care. And thanks everyone for joining us today from all over the place. we hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll send the recording out with some of the follow-up slides that Clive had sent as well, just to illustrate some of the points that he had made today. Great. All right. Thanks all.